Well, howdy, church. It's good to see you today. If you're a guest or visitor, thank you so much for joining us for worship. I'd love to get to know you, and I'll be hanging out at the front of the stage after the service, and so come say hi. I promise I won't bite. Anyway, we're working our way through the back half of 1 Samuel. We're looking at the stories after the story, and this story of 1 Samuel is the David and Goliath story. It's the pinnacle story. But there's a whole lot more that happens after that moment with Saul, and with David, and with the Philistines. It's really pretty incredible. Let me, as you're finding your way to 1 Samuel 21, let me tell you about a thing that's on my bucket list. I got a long list of things that I want to see or do before I die. One of those is to see the Leaning Tower of Pisa, like, I want to see it for myself. Because it every time I see a picture of it, it shocks me that this structure continues to stand, right? Have you ever seen it? I mean, this thing is just leaning, and it continues to lean. And then if you look at the history of it, it just continues to lean even more. And it's really remarkable, the fact that it was built in the 12th and 13th century, and even with, again, limited construction materials and limited construction knowledge, that this thing continues to stay standing. It's defying, the laws of physics. But what's interesting, if you look at this leaning tower, you might, if you're uninformed, you might suspect that the reason that it leans is because someone did some bad math. And that someone didn't cut a right angle, like something wasn't plumb, or something wasn't flush, or someone didn't have a level. But if you were to say that, you would actually be wrong. Because the reason actually that the tower leans is not because of its construction and not because of the methods or the materials, but it leans because of its foundation. That actually the soil foundation underneath the structure is too soft to support the weight of the structure. And so again, the ground continues to kind of give way to some regard. And because of this, the imperfect foundation that this structure is resting upon, it is now producing imperfections throughout this tower. Like there are evidences of the stress and cracks and things. Now there's been a lot of rehabilitation efforts by the Italian government in order to rebuild it and correct it. But everything that's built upon this imperfect foundation is showing marks of imperfection, despite they're trying really hard for perfection. And you may be asking yourself, what does this have to do with today? Well, to some degree, we have to consider that everything we read in 1 Samuel is essentially being built upon an imperfect foundation. See, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, there was a moment where Israel demands a king. They had previously been led by the judges, and that was the system that God wanted to govern his people. But Israel began to look around to the other nations and other peoples, and they say, we want a king like everybody else. We want a kingdom like everyone else has. Give us this. They petition Samuel, who's kind of the mouthpiece of God, and they say, hey, give us it. And Samuel goes before God, and God says, listen, it's not good for them to be ruled and reigned by a king. And in fact, everything's going to go bad. There's going to be a lot of pain if they get it their way. But God's people continue to hear the warnings and then continue to make demands. Give us a king already. God's like, you don't want a king? They go, yes, we want a king. No, we don't. You don't want a king? Yes, we want a king. And eventually, at the end of it, God says, have it your way. Side note, some of the greatest pains in our life will not be because God didn't give us what we asked for, but because God gave us exactly what we asked for. Because we asked for something that was not good, unhealthy. God says, okay, have it your way. But everything from 1 Samuel chapter 8 through chapter 31 is essentially, it's the construction of men and systems and leaders that are essentially trying to build upon an imperfect foundation. Because the origins of the story and the origin of the kingdom and the kingship is so, essentially, it's broken. It's a crooked and fractured foundation. And so you begin to see the fracturing and see the imperfections of the people. And in every story, you'll find something that's wrong. And we'll get moments where we see like a character, and we see David, and we're like, man, this is a good man. He's a better man. He's God's man after God's own heart. He's the perfect man for the job. And then as the story goes, you see his imperfections. And you wonder, why are we seeing so many imperfections in this man? And One of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why we're seeing these imperfections is he is essentially being built upon an imperfect foundation. The sermon before the sermon today I would give to you is that we should be very careful as believers upon the foundations which we build upon. I've seen two best friends build their friendship on a foundation of shared hate for someone else or something else. And then that BFF, right, that they have this shared hatred for, and all of a sudden they betray them and then they act surprised. Or I've seen someone, a church that starts from a split, try building a healthy congregation on an unhealthy launch team. A marriage built on the dissolution of another marriage produced because of an affair. Try to build lifelong love off of the toxic origins. It doesn't work usually. So as a Christian, to be very careful of the foundations which you build upon. Okay, that's the sermon before the sermon. But again, that's maybe some of the explanation of why we see David in this 21st chapter. He begin to compromise in some ways. Let's read. Then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came to meet David, trembling, and said to him, why are you alone and no one with you? And David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has charged me with a matter and said to me, let no one know anything of the matter which I send you and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is here. Let's pause. What is taking place? That David is on the run. He's a fugitive from justice. Well, he's a fugitive from Saul. Saul is trying to kill David. David gets out of Dodge, and then he runs to Ahimelech. Now, he's making this up. He's pretending in the presence of Ahimelech that the reason that he's there is because he's been sent on this secret mission, hoping that Ahimelech does not actually disclose to Saul that he's had interactions with David. Okay? That is what's going on. He says, give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is there. Verse 4. And the priest answered David, I have no common bread on hand, but there's holy bread. If the young men have kept themselves from women, and David answered the priest, truly women have been kept from us always when I go on an expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy even when it's an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be unholy? Basically, Ahimelech is asking if they're ceremonially clean, or David is ceremonially clean. So the priest gave him the holy bread. For there was no bread there but the bread of the presence. You may underline that. Which is to be removed from before the Lord, to be replaced by hot bread on the day that is taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg, the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. Then David said to Ahimelech, then have you not here a spear or a sword at hand? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. And the priest said, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take it, then take it, for there is none but that here. And David said, there is none like it, give it to me. Then David rose, fled that day from Saul, and went to Achish, the king of Gath. Achish is the king of the Philistines. And the servants of Achish said to him, is not this David the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul is struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Now, it's ironic to me that David, who's killed tens of thousands of Philistines, has now just run to Philistia to meet with the leadership of this kingdom, right? And he is carrying the sword of the secret weapon of the Philistines, what David killed, Goliath. It's ironic, isn't it? David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. Basically, he says, they recognize who I am and what I've done. And so David, he changed his behavior before them, pretending to be insane in their hands. And he made marks on the gates of their gate. He let spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? This is God's word. There's a lot we could talk about in regards to this 21st chapter in 1 Samuel, but I want to give you 4 thoughts today from this 21st chapter. The first thought is actually a question, and it's rhetorical. How do you respond when you feel threatened? How do you respond when you feel unsafe? right? David is responding. This whole chapter is kind of a reactionary chapter to the fact that, again, David feels unsafe. He feels like his life is threatened. In fact, Saul is determined to kill him. There's been 3 attempts on David's life. 3 times David has dodged the spear of Saul. In fact, Saul is so determined to kill David that at one time he attempts to kill Jonathan because he loves David. His own son is essentially threatened because of the relationship and the affiliation with David. David feels unsafe. He knows he's unsafe. He knows his life is threatened. He's not just assuming it or just sensing it, but the threat is very real and it's very present. And so he leaves and he goes on a run. Now we see David do 4 things in this text. 4 things because he feels unsafe. The first is this: he runs to spiritual leadership, right? He's essentially taking refuge in the house of God, and he's trying to get near a leader of God, Ahimelech, the high priest. He knows because Saul is not just he's not a good man. In fact, he's a wicked man. He's a wicked king. We know that wickedness is not going to want to have any interactions with the truth of God or the people of God. So he feels like, hey, this is probably a safe space for me to be in. But also, I believe that David is trying to find wisdom and instruction about how he's supposed to navigate the threat that he's experiencing right now. The question is, where do you run and to whom do you run when you feel threatened? Do you seek godly counsel? Do you seek out spiritual wisdom? Do you seek a spiritual authority in your life to speak into your situation, to tell you how to navigate the complexities of the threat or the unsafety that you're wrestling with right now? Most of us, when we feel unsafe, we try to make ourselves feel safe by collecting information. We go to all the experts of the world. We'll go grab every YouTube video in order to help us kind of understand what's going on. We'll try to talk to our co-workers. We'll try to gripe to all of our friends or to neighbors. We'll chat with any person we can online. But usually after we've done all the other things, all the natural things, we then consider, well, maybe I should access a spiritual voice to speak into the situation. And it's just sad. It's just this is pastoral opinion only. Most people put the spiritual wisdom and spiritual leadership as the thing they will go to last when they're experiencing a threat in their life. In fact, maybe actually we should kind of mimic the heart of David here. We should access spiritual authorities and spiritual leadership first. Now, this isn't me self-exalting to the point where I'm basically setting myself up as the person that's going to help you resolve your conflict. No, there's a lot of other spiritual leaders in our life. You ought to have multiple spiritual leaders in your life. Spiritual mentors, people that are discipling you, investing in you, pouring in you, people that are beyond you in terms of biblical understanding and knowledge that you can come to and say, hey, listen, I got to present this problem. I'm feeling unsafe. I'm feeling threatened. I'm feeling like there's some chaos in my life. How would you navigate it? Do you have a spiritual leader or a spiritual authority in your life? If you don't, you're probably unhealthy. Second thing that David does when he feels threatened, feeling unsafe, he begins to care about his physical provisions. He collects food and weapons. So David needs food. He knows he's no longer welcome at the king's table. Previously, we realized that David was regularly feasting in the palace, or he's regularly feasting in the house of Saul. He's eating at the king's table, eating the king's food. He's eating well. No longer. It's over. It's expired. It's not going to happen for him anymore. And in fact, he knows that existing in Israel, right, he's probably not going to get any refuge or handouts from fellow citizens. We know the king's after this guy. I can't help this guy. He's a true fugitive. But then he comes to Ahimelech, and he's like, okay, Ahimelech, we know that you are ultimately aligned with a higher king. I need some food. Give me what you got. And Ahimelech kind of reluctantly gives him showbread, or bread of the presence. Now, if you're not Jewish, you're not Hebrew, maybe not studied on the Old Testament, you're like, what is showbread or bread of the presence? Let me give you a little insight as to this special holy bread, okay? The bread of the presence is bread that was baked by the priest, and they would bake 12 loaves of it, and they would present it in the house of God, and it was supposed to just sit in the house of God for an entire week. That bread then was going to be replaced on the Sabbath. So the priest would bake this bread, these 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and then they would replace it on Saturday. They would take the old bread away and put new, hot, fresh bread on that Saturday. Now, that old bread was actually not really that old, and so the priests were allowed then to eat it in order to sustain themselves. right? It's a sense of sustenance for the priest. It's caring for the priestly tribe. Now, what's significant about bread of the presence is, think about this. It's like, why is it called bread of the presence? Right? Well, this is God's bread, and it's in God's house. And if someone was to eat God's bread in God's house, they're going to be eating it in God's presence. Now, what is the significance to that? Well, I know if someone's eating my bread in my house, in my presence, they're not an enemy. Only friends eat my bread in my house, in my presence, right? God is communicating to people. He's created this thing, this really practical reminder to the priestly tribe and actually all of Israel. No. If you're going to eat this stuff, listen, you're eating in my house, in my presence, because you are a friend, because there's no longer enmity that exists between God and mankind because of the blood. It's really pretty incredible. But David, he's not just satisfied with food, right? What does he say next? He's like, give me some food, give me some bread. Oh, we don't have any common bread. We have holy bread. Well, he basically ends up convincing Ahimelech to give him this holy or consecrated bread. And then he says, you got a sword? You got any weapons? And then David makes up a story about the fact that he had to run out of town, like he had to leave the house so quickly, I forgot my weapons at home. You got a weapon for me? You have a spear? You got a sword here? I need something to defend myself. Here's the replay of it. I'm going to read the words. It says, David said to Ahimelech, is there not a spear or sword? I had to get out quickly. And it says, and the priest said, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah, behold, it's here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you take it, for there's none but that here. David knows this sword. He's used this sword before. He grabs the sword and feels comfortable. He's now maybe experienced a little sense of confidence. Now, some people read into this text and they dramatize this moment and they believe that in fact this is actually evidence of a faith crisis for David, right? That David is operating his own strength. That this man is trying to, again, wield the sword because it's a little bit different than how he approached Goliath, right? This boy didn't stand against Goliath with a sword. In fact, he used Goliath's sword to kill him. He stands with just a sling. He is outgunned as he steps into conflict or steps into war. But he is not outgunned in terms of faith. One man said that David might have been carrying the sword of Goliath, but David should have been carrying the faith that killed Goliath. But I'm not sure I completely agree that David's in a faith crisis. Maybe there's a dip in our faith, but I don't think he's abandoned faith. But this moment here in David's story leads me to this question. Should the people of God carry swords? And should Christians carry swords? Now you're like, I'm not tempted to carry a sword. I haven't seen any swords today. But what about our modern day sword? Should a Christian carry a modern day sword? Should a Christian carry a firearm? Now, I'm no idiot. I know the number of guns in this room may rival the number of Bibles in this room. But if you would allow me to tiptoe into the subject matter, I think it could be beneficial. And I would ask you just for a second to just allow yourself maybe to be challenged. This week, the news media got consumed with the Tyree Nichols story, right? Very tragic. So sad. Heart breaks for what happened. The news, in my pastoral opinion, really escalated the tension by creating this false narrative that the city was going to burn. And then the city didn't burn. It made us think that was going to happen. But it's actually really interesting. The New York Times reported the day after that it was shocked by how little real conflict actually existed in the city. That there was actually only 3 protesters arrested. No police officers reported actually any kind of like going to the hospital or having to receive medical treatment. Only one windshield was actually broken. Which in light of all things, it's pretty remarkable, isn't it? But they told us on Tuesday that everything was going to become chaos, right? Over and over again, everywhere we went, we were told what was going to happen. Listen, you ought to operate in fear. Listen, this city will be unsafe. This entire area is unsafe. This day is unsafe. You should feel threatened. Now, they didn't say that explicitly, but that is the messaging under their messaging. And it worked. I felt unsafe. All day Tuesday, 6 o'clock release. Videos coming out. Make sure you're away from the city. All day I lived with kind of just this weird sense of tension. Like, what do I do? What's going on? But because I felt threatened, because I felt unsafe, I went and grabbed a gun, and I just put it on my hip the entire day. My kids, we homeschooled, they were around, and they said, "Dad, what are you doing? Why do you?" And I looked at them, I was like, I don't really know. I feel unsafe. I feel like I need it today. They asked me a bunch of questions. I had tried to navigate the things that were happening in the world. But then, after it was over, on the other side of the day, I have to ask myself the question, was that right that I reacted in that way? Should I have been carrying a gun? Is there a biblical case to be made for what I was doing right now? Is that the best way to handle feelings when you're unsafe or feeling vulnerable? I feel like a Christian has to investigate their motives on a regular basis, to ask themselves why they do the things that they do. So on the other side of the conflict, I had to ask myself these questions. What was really going on in my heart? And did I really handle it the right way? And so I came up with a framework. These are questions that I asked myself this week about my gun carrying to see whether or not, again, I was doing what is best. And again, if you're in this moment, you're looking for like a yes or no, right or wrong type of answer regarding to whether or not a Christian should carry a firearm, I'm not going to give you that. But I want to give you maybe something that's beneficial to you. I'm going to give you a framework for helping you ask some questions of your own self in regards to firearms. Okay? This may feel a little unusual for church, but I think it can be beneficial for the people in this room. First is this. The first question I had to ask myself is, does this violate my conscience? Does it violate my conscience? See, there's a lot of things in which we have a right to do, but again, if we still exercise a right, we're still violating our sense of conscience. Romans 14 says it's better not to eat meat or drink wine or to do anything that causes a brother to stumble. That means it's within your right to eat a certain food and drink wine, but it's going to actually cause certain people to stumble. That means it's going to be a violation of their conscience, and so therefore you ought to exercise some level of caution. And so that's why you can have one Christian that would say, I saw this movie, and another Christian in this circle over there saying, I refuse to see that movie because, listen, something doesn't settle in my heart. Right? Something is unsettling about seeing this thing. It's like, who's right or wrong? Probably it's a matter of conscience. Now, here's what I've learned, though, is the conscience is oftentimes, it's a gift from God. And to violate our conscience, right, is essentially, I believe, to violate that gift that God has given to us. It's the first thought. Second thought I would give you, part of the framework, is it wise? Is it wise? Is it wise in light of my current environment? Is it wise in light of my competency? Is it wise in light of my family or my situation? This is a complex question. I can't answer it for you. You have to ask yourself, is it wise? Because I know that for some people to carry a gun, it's probably very unwise because they don't actually have the competency to use the gun. And that's why there's so many statistics about the fact that someone pulls the gun and that very gun is used against them. Is it wise when you have a bunch of kids run around you? Right? Is it wise for me, have a firearm on my hip if there's going to be 4 little ones trying to crawl over daddy? Third point, is it necessary? Is it necessary? Like, is it really necessary for me to then carry this firearm and try to be, have this thing that's going to self-protect me or like it's going to care for my family? Is it necessary? Or have I made up something in my head that tells me that there really is a threat when it's actually not a threat? Like, is someone coming to Hernando, Mississippi, they're going to come to my street and they're going to knock through my doors? Is it really going to happen? maybe it's not necessary. Here's the fourth question I would ask is, am I too dependent on it? And you might be asking yourself this question: what does it mean to be too dependent upon a firearm? Well, most of us carry the firearm for a sense of safety and security, correct? But have I become too dependent on that sense of security, and I have neglected to see that my ultimate sense of security comes from God? See, some of us are actually going to disregard the truths that are saturate our scriptures, that our life is held in his hands. Listen, our life is not in our own hands. And some of us, we're going to just forget this. We throw that truth out the window thinking, no, my life is in my hands. And that is not true. Because in a moment, my life could come to an end. In a moment, he could call me home. In a moment, even if I'm wearing the seatbelt and I'm living the healthiest life and the safest life, in a moment, he could say, enough's enough. So, am I becoming too dependent upon providing for my own safety? And I have not leaned on a father, a good father, to provide for my safety? Now, I'm not saying neglect the seatbelt. And I'm not saying live your doors unlocked. But making sure that we keep in mind that our ultimate security is from a King Most High. Here is the next question. Am I law-abiding? Because some of us who grab the gun and we're not law-abiding. Right? We'll cross state lines, laws change, right? Carry permits are different in different states. But listen, a Christian has an obligation to be law-abiding. Do you know that? The only time we get to step outside the law is when the laws of man are in violation of the laws of God. And last time I checked, the Second Amendment wasn't in the Bible. So we're like, it's my rights. It's in my rights. No. Listen, I know that Romans 13 says I'm supposed to be subject to governing authorities. I have to submit myself to the laws of the land and those that are providing a governance for humanity, knowing that it's a good gift of God. And so I have to be law-abiding. Now, if you are law-abiding, and the fact that governing authorities has said that, hey, listen, you actually do have a right to carry a firearm, well, you can continue. And then he tells us maybe how we can carry that firearm, and we can still be respectable, okay? Are we law-abiding? The next question I would ask you, and the questions I've asked myself is, am I trying to be a peacemaker? Am I trying to be a peacemaker, or am I trying to be a vigilante? Am I trying to be a peacemaker, or am I trying to be a hero? Am I trying to be a peacemaker, or I want to be cool? Am I trying to be a peacemaker, or do I want to feel strong? Am I trying to be a peacemaker, or do I just want to flex? Listen, I'm saying all these things because these are all the things that I have felt at one time or another. And the last one is this: have I considered the power of nonviolence? And in fact, if you think back to this David story, there's been 3 acts of violence displayed against David, and each time he has responded with nonviolence. And in fact, David is in the position that he's in as the future anointed king of Israel because his character is unlike Saul's. And although Saul has been violent towards David, David is not going to be violent towards him. He is going to show Saul, he's going to show the kingdom that things can be done in other ways. And if you think through human history, even American history, think of how many leaders have produced enduring change, lasting impact on the world, and they have operated with nonviolence. And maybe when we feel unsafe and when we feel threat, maybe it might be human nature to draw the gun to try to meet an act of violence with another act of violence. Maybe, perhaps, there's a moment in which nonviolence is actually the greater solution. That's the framework. Is it right or wrong? I'm not going to tell you. I'm just trying to provide maybe some thoughts for you to process. You with me? People give me all these weird looks. They're like, Luke, you got to move on. You're like, okay, we're moving on. All right. Here's the next thing that David does when he feels unsafe. He runs to his enemy's enemy. David runs to his enemy's enemy. He leaves Israel, and he leaves the domain of Saul, and he runs to the Philistines. Is this foolishness or is this wisdom? It looks like foolishness. And I think that David also, he wakes up to his own foolishness in the midst of his fleeing, because when they recognize him and they begin to sing Israel's song, it's like, oh snap, I gotta go. Because the Philistines are singing the Israeli tune. Saul is struck down his thousands and David is tens of thousands, and David knows, again, there are 10,000 widows that exist in this nation because of me. 10,000 families are without men to lead them because of my sword. I gotta go. I made a terrible mistake for trying to seek refuge from my enemy's enemy. What do we learn from this? Humanity often goes blind in chaos. We often go blind when we are feeling unsafe and we are no longer acting on intellect but acting on impulse. And so, believer, do different. Here's the next thing too. He operates in dishonesty. Now, this isn't a recommendation. This is just a report. David all of a sudden begins to compromise because he's feeling threatened. He starts to lie to cover his tail. Here's the second thought I give to you today is when we look at this 21st chapter, and not just this 21st chapter, but all the chapters in 1 Samuel, can you see the difference between customs and commands? And I think this is probably true for all narratives in our scriptures. Can you see the difference between customs and commands? See, there is a big difference between a biblical custom that is being reported to us and a biblical command that God is demanding of us. And here in this moment, this whole thing about the bread is really, it's a tension between a custom and a command. Jesus actually referenced this story. Are you familiar with this? In Mark chapter 2, this is what Jesus says. It says, one Sabbath, he was going through the grain yards, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, what have you never read what David did? And that he was in need and was hungry, and he and those who were with him, and he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest. Now, it's a different name. It's not Ahimelech, but Abiathar is the son of Ahimelech, right? Their family. And they ate the bread of presence. And then it says, which is not lawful. Now, this isn't a law of God. This is the law of humanity. If you look back on Jewish customs, right, they oftentimes would put together a long list of things that people had to do in order to stay clean or to stay right. But they weren't God-given. They were man-created. And they're really just, again, a sense of recommendations, their sense of tradition to help us maintain our sense of purity, but they are not the same as the thou shalt of the scriptures. He says, is it not lawful for any of the priests to eat and also give it to those who are with him? And they said to him, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is even Lord of the Sabbath. What is the point that Jesus is trying to make? No. It was essentially forbidden for people to eat this bread of the presence, this consecrated and holy bread, right? But it was forbidden because it was non-customary, not because it's a violation of a command. God had never said, thou shalt not eat the bread of the presence. No, in fact, there is some Levitical instruction that says it was there to feed or nourish those that belong to the priestly tribe, but it's not necessarily forbidden. It was primarily designed to be nourishment to these certain people, but it wasn't necessarily forbidden that other people would be able to participate in it. But we have now this moment where Ahimelech is resistant, saying, no, you can't have this. But again, this custom feels like a command. It feels like a thou shalt, and not essentially like a suggestion or a good thing that aids in spiritual health. And it's really good for us as a Christian to know the difference between customs and commands. And there's a major difference between these two things. And the more customs, traditions, and routines we build into our spiritual lives, the more that I believe that we are at risk at believing that those customs are non-negotiable. The longer we're a Christian, the more customs that we establish in our life, the more those customs begin to feel like commands. And have you ever wondered why churches split over the stupidest of stuff? That someone will change the worship tunes or the way in which it's going to worship, or they'll add some drums to the stage and the whole congregation will just fall apart. Why? Because usually it's a violation of a tradition, and it's a violation of a custom. That's not customary for our church. But guess what? If you've existed with that custom long enough, they begin to feel like commands. And so you protect them like commands. And so you're willing to divide over them like they're commands. But they're really not commands. And so it's just a warning. If you are a seasoned saint in this room, you've been walking with Jesus for a long time, we have to be very open about the customs and the traditions and the rhythms of our local church and our spiritual lives and our gatherings, knowing that they have a tendency to feel like they're thou shouts, and we have to guard them and protect them that way, but they're not. And if you begin to treat customs like commands, ultimately you become a slave to those customs. And that's why Jesus says, no, understand. The Sabbath, that's my gift to you. You're not a gift to it. You weren't created for Sabbath. No, Sabbath's created for you. It is a good system for you to find rest. You've created all these things, all these customs about it, but now you become a slave to it. And you're missing the point. Here's a third thought I would give to you today, is we have to work to decipher what is prescriptive and what is descriptive. Dale Ralph Davis says that the author here, Samuel, he is clearly trying to report, but he is not trying to recommend. Whenever we run into narrative, there's a whole lot of narrative in our Bible. We have to be very careful about how we read it and how we interpret it. We can't be flippant with it, because not everything that we see described here is actually prescribed for our life. And what we're going to see in 1 Samuel is when we look at the life of David, we're going to see there's a lot of flaws and there's a lot of failures in this man. But these aren't prescribed for our spiritual lives. And in fact, that list of things that David did when he felt threatened and unsafe, those are not prescriptions for how you ought to conduct yourself. No, God has shown the good and the bad of all people in these narratives, so that we could, again, learn from the things that are done right, but also can we be warned about the things that they've done wrong, and we can steer ourselves away from them. We have to be very careful. What is reporting? What is recommending? What is prescriptive? What is descriptive? And this is really helpful. If you run into a Bible critic, someone that mocks the scriptures and pokes at the scriptures and say that, hey, this book's a joke. A lot of times people have arrived at that position that the Bible is a joke because they have come into a narrative and they have kind of messed these things up, that which is descriptive and that which is prescriptive. They saw David do something terrible and they think that God has then said that we have to do that terrible thing. And then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, that book is messed up, stay away. It's a joke of a book. You've got to run from it. And in fact, it's just they've had bad hermeneutics. They've really interpreted the scriptures in the wrong way. They've been too flippant about things. One reason I love the Bible and I trust the Bible is God puts the good and the bad out there in these stories. He's not trying to whitewash the leaders to make them perfect, knowing that the only perfect person that we'll actually find in the book is Jesus. And we see a bunch of imperfect people that God is using to construct his ultimate purpose for the world. That's why I like the scriptures. Thought 4. David appears to be an Old Testament shrewd manager. Are you familiar with that New Testament parable, the shrewd manager? It's found in Luke chapter 16. We went through in a Seeing Jesus Together reading plan. I don't know, was it this week, last week? I get my days confused. Anyway, it's a parable that Jesus told about the fact that, again, a manager of a rich man's wealth was essentially going to be terminated because he had mismanaged the money. And then when he realized he's about to be terminated, he then goes to those people that are in debt to this wealthy man and says, let me settle the debts. But he settles them for much less than what is actually owed. So he says, hey, you owe him 100, hey, just give me 50. You owe him 75, give me 25. And then he returns to his master as the manager and says, look what I bring to you, right? Now, he's dishonest in his settling of the debts. In his shrewdness, it is dripping with dishonesty. That's what we see with David. Both with Ahimelech and with the king of Gag, right? Both of these men, there's a level of dishonesty. He goes to Ahimelech and he is shrewd and he's wise. He's trying to guard himself in some ways. He doesn't want Saul to track him down. He doesn't want him to come to Ahimelech and say, hey, which way did David go, right? He's trying to guard himself, but yet he's still dishonest. Oh, the king sent me on a secret mission. Don't talk about it. Shh. He's dishonest. He's lying. The same way with King of Gag. Oh, listen, I'm here. And then next thing we know, it's like, I'm going to pretend I'm crazy. I'll pretend I'm insane. This guy will leave me alone. But a Christian must know that it is possible to be both shrewd and honest. And that there is a level of shrewdness or a level of wisdom that we might grab a hold of. That, again, helps us avoid the situations that would keep us from being tempted to compromise. There's a level of wisdom which you can attain that will allow you to outthink these situations which you can be tempted to lie. And in the story, again, the guy is commended. The shrewd manager is commended. He's applauded. But he's applauded for the wisdom and not for his dishonesty. But when you read this about David, you think, man, this good man, this great man, the man after God's own heart, the future king of Israel, he's not that perfect. We kind of set him up as like this perfect man. You know, he's going to be the new perfect king. But then we read this chapter and we're like, this is an imperfect leader. And then I was reminded this week of a quote from Skip Heitzig. He said, the best of men are still men at best. That men are still men. Men are still imperfect. That we are all fallen. We're all broken. There's no way for us to live to perfection. It's impossible. And sometimes we have a problem of elevating men to certain positions in our lives where we kind of subconsciously believe they are perfect and good men. And then we get close to them and we're surprised. No, their fallenness is apparent. Listen, if you get close enough to me, you'll realize there's some brokenness in me. And if you are tempted to elevate me or exalt me or to think that he's a good man, he's a super godly man, he's a perfect man. No, listen, I am an imperfect man. And the only reason I exist on the stage today is because of the grace of God. And then if you get near me for long enough, you'll begin to see that, no, there's some really nasty parts of my life. And you'll be incredibly disappointed if you elevate me to a position that I'm not supposed to be in. The only person we exalt, the only person that we elevate in our lives is Jesus Christ. He's the only perfect person. We pursue integrity. I pursue uprightness. But still, there's going to be moments where I fall short. But praise God, I'm not holding the whole world in my hands. There's someone better that's going to hold it in our hands. It's really interesting about this story is right after 1 Samuel 21, David writes a psalm. Are you familiar with the Psalms? Some of us have a tendency to believe that all the Psalms were written together, like it was all just one collection, and it was just like David sat down and he just penned them all together. Actually, he penned them throughout his life, and this is a big collection. Psalm 34 is actually the psalm that was written on the heels of the 21st chapter. And if you look at your actual physical Bible, if you look at the heading of it, it actually talks about Abimelech, which is, again, it's a reference to a Philistine title, which is Achish, the king of Gag. And these are the words of Psalm 34. It's a beautiful psalm, and I want to read it to you today as we close. It says, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul makes its boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and he delivered me from all of my fears. All of that threat, all those feelings of being unsafe, God deals with. And he said, those who look to him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. Taste and see. You can imagine he breaking that bread of the presence, and he's eating, and he recognizes that these provisions are not because of his own work, but because of the work of God in his life. He eats and he tastes and he says, the Lord, he is good. But guess what? Today we get something better as New Testament saints than bread of the presence. And in the Gospel of John, what is one of the I am statements? Jesus, in a really powerful moment, says, I am the bread of life. And that we can find a sustenance for eternity, not for the day, for eternity in Christ Jesus. We get to feast on him, and it is good. And today, guess what? We are going to take the Lord's Supper. And it's a really practical moment for us to taste and see that the Lord is good. That we remember that the Son of God died on Calvary and that he poured out his blood in order that our sins might be dealt with. And that we didn't deserve it and we didn't earn it and there's nothing we can do to pay him back for it. But it was still a good gift. It's extended to all of us. And to anyone that's accepted that gift, we have been brought into this family. We are friends of God. The enmity has been dealt with. This is the good news of the gospel. And we get to remind ourselves in this moment, we will take the bread and we will say, oh, we get to taste. This is a representative of the goodness of God, this salvation that has been provided through Jesus. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for today. Your word, your Son. Thank you for a better bread, a bread of life that doesn't just sustain us for the minute and for the moment, for the day, but it sustains us for eternity. Father, we thank you so much for your goodness. Help us now as we take the Lord's Supper to taste and see that you are good. I pray these things in your name. Amen.